Every week here on Shift Key, Heatmap's weekly podcast about decarbonization and the shift away from fossil fuels. My co-host Jesse Jenkins and I look at one piece of news. We each pull out one news item from the past week. And if it's making us feel more upbeat about the energy transition, it's an upshift. That's what we call it at least. And if it's making us feel more downbeat, we call it a downshift. Jesse, it's been a busy week. What have you brought for us?
Well, I think this is going to be an upshift. We got to see how this shakes out. But this week, President Xi Jinping of China committed the country to producing a comprehensive emissions reduction plan as part of the UN climate process that for the first time would cover all economic sectors and all greenhouse gases. So expanding their focus from just CO2 produced by the energy sector, which their current targets have focused on, and that's the bulk of their emissions, but not all of it, to covering all sectors, including industry and all greenhouse gases, including important ones like nitrous oxides and methane. Obviously, we can't get to net zero greenhouse gas emissions unless we're talking about all of those greenhouse gas emissions. So this will be the first commitment and first climate plan from China that would cover all of those. I think what makes it an upshift is that President Xi has starting to stake his own personal reputation on this. And I think as a response to President Trump walking away, taking the United States away from its commitment to decarbonization, Xi said on Wednesday last week that no matter how the international situation changes, China will not slow down its efforts to address climate change. That's a quote from the president. So what we don't know yet, and the reason why we still got to see how this shakes out, is they have not actually put numbers on that pledge yet. That will come later this year as part of the nationally determined contributions or the overall climate targets that the various parties to the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change are updating in advance of a November meeting in Brazil this year. So we'll have to keep an eye on what the target is. China has pledged so far to cap and begin to decline CO2 emissions from energy by 2030. And to substantially reduce by 65% below 2020 levels the emissions intensity of the economy. So basically decouple economic growth from CO2 production. You got to do that if you want to continue to grow while reaching net zero. They are on track, it looks like, to hit that peak, perhaps a couple years early, depending on how things shake out over the next couple of years. But they are not on track at the moment to hit that emissions intensity target. And so they're going to update both of those, right? The overall emissions cap, which should now extend beyond CO2 to all greenhouse gases in industry. And we expect an updated emissions intensity trajectory as well. And it'll be interesting to see how ambitious those goals are. I think that will reflect, given that this has now risen to the level of the president's personal priority, what China's ambitions are for the next 5 years and what they think is attainable, because I can't see President Xi wanting to tie his reputation to a goal that they're not going to meet. So whatever they state here.
I can't imagine a president of a country wanting to do that, Jesse.
No, I don't think in this case they do. So I think it's going to be a key one to watch, but encouraging signs that China is stepping up reputationally to fill the vacuum left by the United States as President Trump walks away. And China, it has an enormous force in terms of influence on global emissions and, of course, development trajectories for the rest of the world as it kind of builds out its clean tech empire across the global economy. So I'll call that an upshift for now, but we'll have to keep an eye on what exactly the target is when they release that later this year and how ambitious it looks like.
It's so interesting. China, we can see it's in some places as it tries to respond to the Trump moment, right? We can see it like upholding parts of the international system or trying to buttress parts of the international system that Trump is abandoning, such as climate policy. And other places we see it being opportunistic. One thing that Trump is doing, it feels like, is driving Europe and China closer together. And there's reasons why each has an interest to be. There's security reasons for Europe to want to be closer to China. There's economic reasons for China to want to be closer to Europe. It's a source of final demand that the United States might no longer want to supply. And Europe takes climate change very seriously. There's lots of reasons for China to step up. I mean, I think in that light, it's particularly an interesting development.
Yeah, it's going to be interesting to watch the politics of the COP, the climate meeting in November. In Brazil, I can easily imagine the optics of China, the European Union, and Brazil standing side by side, making bold pledges to continue forward, and the United States entirely absent. And it's going to speak volumes to where the rest of the world is going in terms of its relationships.
It's one of these places where the Trump administration often acts as if other countries don't have internal politics of their own.
Right.
This is not that far. This isn't that far a secondary consequence of the policies that the Trump administration has pursued. And to be clear, I think China would be pursuing some form of climate policy it has already demonstrated that it's going to adopt some form of climate policy, even if that climate policy is only facial in the past, regardless of what the international environment is. It just is one of these areas where the Trump administration doesn't always seem to be acting in the awareness that, more than 190 other countries in the world have their own internal politics. Part of the point of foreign policy is to deal with that.
Secondary effects are not exactly Trump's strong suit, I would say. Rob, what do you have on your side today?
I have the biggest Upshift in so long, Jesse. I have a
There we
giant
go.
Upshift.
All right.
My Upshift sells for $20,000 after incentives, and it's available potentially in Q4 2026. Right. I think many Shift Key listeners and viewers will have seen this. This new auto company, Slate, came out of stealth mode just last week and announced their first vehicle. And their first vehicle is a vehicle that we have hypothesized here on Shift Key for a long, long time. It seems like it's finally going to happen. It is a 2-door, rudimentary electric pickup truck, like an old Ford Ranger. They basically made an old Ford Ranger in electric form. And there's two really, really interesting things about this pickup. And, there was reporting from Sean Kane at TechCrunch about a few weeks before the announcement that this was maybe in the works. Jeff Bezos is one of a dozen or so investors in Slate. There's two things that really draw my attention about this. The first is that I think Slate has had, since they came out of stealth last week, just an incredible launch. They're all over social media. My friends who have nothing to do with climate and who really don't even have a lot to do with cars are talking about them. I've seen influencers.
Yeah, masterfully executed.
Yeah, I've seen influencers who don't work on anything related to climate or cars talk about how much they liked a Slate ad. It's been really inventive, exciting, as a treat that almost are treating the vehicle sector like a direct consumer product, which I guess it is, but which is a very different take than we've seen from other EV companies, even EV companies that do sell directly to the consumer like Rivian and Tesla. The second thing is that the business model for the car is really interesting. They say they're aiming for a final price of about $28,000 before incentives with IRA tax credits, which we'll see if they survive. They think they can get it down to below $20,000, which is a crazy price for a new vehicle. There are half a dozen cars on the market, if that sell for under $20K. New cars on the market. There's that many left.
With inflation lately, yeah.
And the way they're doing it is really interesting, which is that when you buy the Slate vehicle, you are buying the closest thing to a box with wheels and a bed that the US government will basically let you sell. The car has crank windows. It has no radio. It basically has nothing in the dashboard except climate controls, which will be physical buttons, which is very cool, and a phone holder. And then you'll be able to go in and buy DIY upgrades for the vehicle that you then have to install yourself that will let it do other things, that will let you put in a radio or a sound system,
or even transform it into
an SUV,
yes, or other
turn
things.
it into kind of like a beachcomber or an off-roader or something, some other kind of vehicle.
Whatever.
And those are where a lot of the margin is going to come for Slate. That's you buy a vehicle, it has a life of 3 to 7 years, and then you keep buying accessories. And in those accessories is where they think they can make up their margin, which is an interesting model. It's kind of similar to Harley Davidson. Andrew Mosman wrote for Heatmap this week about how it's also like Spirit Airlines. But there's a lot of guys who think they talk about wanting an old Ford Ranger or an old, Toyota. And there's various cars that are sold but not in the US market. I think there's two other things I'm just going to call out about this car because we wanted the electric pickup for so long, Jesse, and I feel like now it's finally here. There's two more things I want to say about this car. The first is that the range in the base model, the range is 150 miles when you get the 20K version. You can upgrade to an extended range battery to get 240 miles. That's fine. It's not incredible. It compares pretty negatively, I think, to other EVs on the road, especially in Q4 26 when they plan to release the vehicle. But it's how they're getting the cost down. The second thing that I think is really, really interesting is that it's not clear to me that you could make a truck with this footprint under current emissions rules. Like one thing that has
internal
happened,
combustion truck,
an internal combustion truck with this footprint. One thing that's happened since 2010 is that the US has rolled out much more stringent emission standards. And basically, the larger you make the vehicle, the more it can pollute. And this has led to a lot of domestic automakers making larger and larger vehicles, not only to meet emission standards, but to satisfy, a larger vehicle can be more profitable for various reasons. Basically, costs don't scale with vehicle footprint in quite the same way, but the price scales a lot with the vehicle footprint, so you can cram more margin. We've previously talked about how 90% of GM and Ford's profit, at least in the most recent year, came from selling SUVs and trucks to North American buyers, even though they sell only about half their vehicles to North Americans. It's just insanely profitable. And that means that there's been a lot of incentives to sell increasingly larger vehicles with internal combustion engines. I think one thing we're seeing that's interesting with Slate that has long been theorized about EVs, but never quite come to fruition, is that with different technical limits on the vehicle, with different regulatory limits, you can make a much smaller vehicle, and you're freed from the conventional form factor that rule ICE cars right now. And I think that's really exciting. We talk about how EVs should allow for a lot of vehicle experimentation and a lot of experimentation in lots of different subsectors of the auto market, and creating lots of new and exciting vehicles. And we don't always see them, but here it is. This is what we've been talking about. It's so exciting.
That's exactly right. Yeah. I mean, I think it's exciting for that reason. It's also exciting to see this sort of experimentation with different modular vehicles. I mean, an electric vehicle is basically like a skateboard with batteries in between, right? It's a very simple, basic platform at its core, as opposed to the complexity of an internal combustion engine and transmission. It really lends itself to this modularity concept. And I'm really curious to see how this takes off. And one of the things I'm curious about is whether the Slate truck succeeds more with the work, community than the personal consumer one, or vice versa, right? Are we going to see this like cell phone cases that personalize your iPhone or whatever? Or is it actually going to be something that really appeals to the work truck community, where it's just a practical round town beat up pickup truck that you can throw whatever you want in? That contractors and landscapers and others have loved those older pickups from the early 2000s for exactly that reason. This is a small, maneuverable, easy to park, but with a full-size bed that you can make good use of. And there's a variety of ways in which you can configure it. So anyway, there's a couple markets there, and I'm curious to see which one it resonates with more. One of the last things I want to note here is that what's interesting is Toyota actually came out with a very similar concept car, the IMV0, or concept truck, I should say, back in November 2023. So a couple years ago, that was a similar concept, but very much geared towards the work segment. And they were thinking about this in Southeast Asia, primarily markets like Thailand and the Philippines. It's a bare bones pickup truck, 2-seat cab, just like the Slate, with a flat bed on the back and the ability to buy bolt-on modules to turn it into a dump truck, to turn it into a flatbed, to turn it into a food truck, whatever you want. So it's interesting to see that despite Toyota coming out the gate 2 years ago with a similar concept, I'll have to follow up. I haven't seen it actually go into production yet, and Slate might beat them to the punch.
And this vehicle format's always existed in the rest of the world. It just hasn't been sold in the US. In part, we should say, because of tariffs. There are cheap pickups made elsewhere in the world, but the US, since the 1960s, has imposed high tariffs on pickup imports, and this has helped to sequester the US truck market off from the rest of the world. It's interesting to see now an upstart competitor internally go after the segment as well. Well, I think we should leave it there.
That sounds good.
Shift Key is a weekly podcast. You can find it wherever you get your podcast. You can also find it at heatmap.news. That's heatmap.news. If you enjoyed this show, of course, like, subscribe, and share. And hey, we'll see you next week, or we'll see you on Shift Key. Talk then.